Thank you, Margaret, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. It's very heartening to see so many people interested in this webinar series from all across the country. When we started planning for these webinars, we understood that each presentation would be limited to time and that we'd be able to reserve only a limited number of individual webinar sessions between SHPO and the Arizona Preservation Foundation. Recognizing that ceramics, glass and bottles, and cans comprise the bulk of artifact assemblages on late historical period sites, we reserved entire webinar sessions for these types. This left us to combine other artifact types in the interest of time and availability. To be truthful, there was no rhyme or reason as to how we combined these other artifact types into the remaining webinar presentations, like the one we're presenting tonight, insulators and ammunition. That being said, as I was preparing this session, I learned that there was a relationship of sorts between insulators and ammunition. While reviewing newspaper articles, from the late 19th century, I found that from the very beginning, it seems, insulators were tempting targets for recreational shooters, whether they were youngsters or drunksters. Indeed, during World War II, telephone and utility companies implored shooters not to be so destructive by appealing to their patriotism and support of the Second Great War overseas. Whereas crimes of vandalism and damage to transmission and telephone lines were meted here in the USA with fines and damages, similar vandalism in other parts of the world, like the Middle East, were much more serious, with violators paying with their hands, feet, or ears, as you can read on the article at the very bottom. Even today, in the new millennium, utility companies continue their struggle with the misdeeds of our Darwin Award candidates, as these headlines illustrate. But enough of this trivial nonsense. Let's begin tonight's session with a discussion on insulators. Insulators were vital to the success of interregional, interstate, national, and even international communication in the late historic period from the mid-19th century through the 20th centuries. The invention of the telegraph in the 1830s and 40s was the impetus for initial construction of utility lines across the United States and its territories. Concurrent with the telegraph was the development of the railroad, at least in the eastern half of the country. These two industries would be intimately connected over the next 60 years, by which time the telephone began to replace the telegraph for communication. Initially, telegraph wire was installed more or less directly on wooden poles, but it was quickly learned that while wood technically does not conduct electricity, rainwater soaking into the wooden poles did present a real danger for these lines and their connectivity. Over the course of the 19th century, glass would become the preferred material for telegraph lines, not only because glass was a poor conductor and did not stay wet for long, but also because they were much more affordable to produce, especially in the era of mass production following the American Civil War. Nonetheless, there were alternative materials used to make telegraph insulators, including wood, hard rubber, and composite styles that utilized all of these materials. Insulators and telegraph lines had expanded significantly by 1861 at the start of the American Civil War. In fact, thousands of miles of line were constructed during the war across the North and the South, constructed specifically for military communication. As shown, while glass was the preferred material, these early insulators were nonetheless crude in form as they were not yet produced in mass quantities. These period glass insulators are known today by collectors as bureau knobs, hats or pilgrim hats, and eggs. Following the Civil War, transcontinental railroads and their branch lines extended westward across the country. As did telegraph lines, a new era of insulator production had begun. As many of you know, Alexander Graham Bell became the world's first crank caller in 1876. The success of the telephone was immediate. Within a matter of years, thousands of phones were in operation across major urban cities in the country. Demand for intercity communication ushered in an entire new generation of phone lines with a wider variety of glass insulators manufactured. As the 20th century progressed, electrical service expanded via the construction of high-power transmission lines. This growth was inspired in part by the development of hydroelectric systems funded by the Bureau of Reclamation, but was especially prolific during and after the Great Depression and World War II, when New Deal and post-war programs funded electrical utilities for rural America. In this period of electrical development, porcelain insulators were made in greater numbers, considering they were more durable than their glass counterparts and would not disrupt connectivity of the high voltage lines. Nevertheless, the glass insulator persisted, as we shall see. As many of us Arizona natives are aware, settlement and growth in this state was largely a post-Civil War phenomenon. The earliest telegraph line that I'm aware of was installed by the US military around 1873, extending from Fort Yuma to Tucson, then north to Fort Whipple. Tombstone, for a very short period in the 1870s and 1880s, boasted a telephone line, as did a select few other towns and cities in the territory, at least in a limited fashion. Telephone lines soon expanded across the territory. Electrical development here in Arizona was initiated with the Childs Irving project on the Verde River as early as 1909. Followed by construction of the Eastern Mining Area's transmission line between Globe and Phoenix via the Apache Trail. During and after the Great Depression in the 1930s, increased demand for residential power, as well as power for underground pumping wells in Maricopa, Pinal, and Yuma counties, led to the expansion of hundreds of miles of transmission lines in rural Arizona for residential, commercial, and industrial use. As a result of these developments across Arizona, historical telephone and utility lines here in Arizona come in all shapes and sizes, all of which require insulators of some form, whether singular or more complex styles like suspension insulators. As I noted before, with the increased voltage of these electrical lines, a stronger material was needed other than glass. Porcelain was the preferred material, although it was initially more expensive to produce. But let's first discuss the glass insulator and its many styles. Here is an image in cross-section detailing the basic components of the glass insulator. Attributes labeled here, like the wire groove, threads, the skirt, and the inner skirt, were added to better protect the wire from moisture. Initially, insulators were unthreaded, but molds were soon developed to create them in threaded form to better secure the insulator on the wooden pins, as shown in the cross-section. In the early 20th century, demand for higher voltage transmission lines increased substantially, resulting in the proliferation of porcelain insulators. Nonetheless, some glass companies developed multi-part glass insulators to compete with the new medium of electricity. By cementing two components together, it was hoped that these insulators would handle higher voltage wires. Again, porcelain was clearly the preferred material for high voltage lines. Glass multi-part types do not appear to have been made in great numbers. Insulators come in all colors, just like bottles and jars. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I can't go into detail about how glass manufacturers achieved what they wanted as far as color is concerned. For tonight's webinar, let's just say that silica or sand is the primary additive for glass, and that iron impurities in sand largely determine the color of a finished product. A sizable amount of iron, for instance, produces shades of amber or brown, as well as olive green. The well-known black glass bottles of the 19th century were, in fact, very dark olive green. Sand with lighter amounts of iron, however, would produce shades of aqua or aquamarine. These colors, whether amber or brown, olive green, or aqua, or aquamarine, are considered natural, considering no additives, or at least very little additives, were used by artisans when producing either bottles or insulators. In order to achieve the clear color we see in our bottles today, any number of agents were added, like manganese, selenium, or arsenic, all of which neutralized the effects of the iron impurities in the sand. Given the unstable nature of these additives, finished products exposed to sunlight might result in items being altered to either an amethyst color, which would indicate manganese was used in the production of the glass, or a light to medium honey or pinkish hue, which indicates selenium was used. Other deeper colors like cobalt blue also used special agents. Excuse me. Generally, insulators of the 19th and 20th centuries were made in various shades of either amber brown, various shades of green or olive green, or even aqua or aquamarine. After all, colors were not necessarily advantageous for the production of insulators, so long as they did their job. Two well-known colored insulators are shown here and called by collectors as Hemingray Blue, which is on the left, and Hemingray Ice Blue, which is on the right. By the way, I'll be using a lot of examples of Hemingray insulators in this webinar this evening, considering they were the most prolific producer of insulators in the late historic period prior to 1960. These two colors shown here were made in large numbers by Hemingray from the early 1900s through the 1930s. I've read that the company identified the perfect source of sand in either Indiana or Missouri, producing these lovely shades with no additives. That is, until the source was used up by the mid-1930s. By this time, Owens Illinois Glass Company had acquired Hemingray, and for the next several decades, they produced almost exclusively clear-colored insulators. As a general rule, clear-colored glass insulators were made almost universally across the industrial spectrum by about 1940. These two photographs perfectly illustrate just what insulators can tell us about when they were made. The colors, amber on the left or brown, and aqua on the right, are considered, as I just summarized, are considered natural colors and would suggest a manufacture prior to 1940. But let's take a look at the other attributes and get an idea of what they tell us. Notice the sharp points shown on the bases of both of these insulators. These are known as drip points. These points were patented by Hemingray in 1893 to provide another means for water to drip off of the insulator and away from the wire. These sharp points were replaced by the early 1920s with more rounded points. So one can reasonably assume that both of these insulators predate at least 1925. Both were made by Hemingray, but as you can see, the company names on these insulators were embossed differently. This is not unique necessarily to insulators, but to all artifact types. Companies in the age of mass production in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were either sold off, were merged, or acquired by larger fish, necessitating changes to their company logos and designs. The insulator on the left is an early company logo, which is embossed with HG Company, or CO. It also includes the patent date of May 2, 1893. One can reasonably assume, therefore, that this insulator was made sometime between 1893 and 1915, considering the 15 to 17-year range for exclusive rights to patents. But wait, look at the shape of the number 2 on that insulator. Collectors call this a swan tube because it actually looks like a swan. This insulator was likely made in a narrow period between 1893 and 1900, based on the many years of research by these collectors. The insulator on the right is also embossed with Hemingray, but it only says Hemingray, reflecting a change in company logos somewhere around the turn of the 20th century. Interestingly, insulators that are embossed with Made in USA appeared sometime between 1919 and the 1920s, based on the available literature. This was a result of federal legislation requiring these marks for international export. I've yet to find a reliable reference as to when this actually occurred, or for that matter, what federal law or statute required this addition to insulators and other glass products. However, the cumulative attributes of the insulator on the right indicates that it was made by at least the early 1920s. Just how many different companies produced insulators, whether glass or porcelain, and in how many different styles? The truth is, I don't know. But we do know there were hundreds of patents submitted and received for everything ranging from various machines used throughout the manufacturing process to patents for specific designs. The one on the left, by the way, is Hemingway's famous pony insulator, which was patented on May 2nd, 1893, along with the distinctive drip points that we just discussed. Companies kept their own system for cataloging the various styles that they made. These style numbers are often embossed on the skirts of the insulators, along with the company name, like the Hemingray number 9 style, or the Armstrong number 14. One can imagine how difficult it would be for collectors of these glass insulators to organize their collections based on the quite numerous different company mold styles that were developed over decades. So collectors came up with their own cataloging system for glass insulators, known as the CD system, which categorizes insulators based on multiple factors, including the insulator's shape and profile, presence or absence of threads, unipart or multi-part styles, and the location of manufacturer, like North America or somewhere else around the world. This system has changed over many decades, though in a very controlled manner. Those shown here are just an example of more than 200 different catalog designs and styles of glass insulators. Now, you'll recall that I earlier mentioned that around 1940, glass insulators were made almost universally with clear colored glass. But that's not always the case, as I learned just several years ago. It was just a few years ago that I was driving to Coolidge to visit the San Carlos Irrigation Project office in central Pinal County. Along the way, I passed transmission towers that sure looked to have aqua-colored suspension insulators, and glass, mind you. Yes, the line was old. It had been constructed over several decades between the 1930s and 1960s. But still, this just seemed odd. Almost every pole had well-maintained aqua suspension insulators on clearly modern poles. I had the opportunity to poke around the basement of the skid maintenance building while I was at Coolidge and discovered several boxes of these insulators, brand new and waiting to be used. As it happens, there are Asian firms that market and sell these glass insulators, glass suspension insulators across the world. Who knew? It's just something to keep in mind when recording glass of any kind. The color isn't necessarily an indicator of age. If you'll just pardon me for a second. Although porcelain insulators are known to have been made for early telegraph lines from the 1850s and 60s, they were not viable as an alternate to glass because of production costs. However, as higher voltage utility lines were developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, porcelain became the material of choice as they were much more durable and could handle higher currents of electricity. As shown here in industrial America, porcelain insulators were mass produced, but in certain areas of the world, they are still made by skilled artisans with the use of special lathes. This lovely couple, as we now know, wasn't just making hanky-panky, but they were also making porcelain insulators. Who knew? Porcelain is also an ideal medium for insulator production, considering insulators must be non-porous in order to offer protection on a high voltage line. Like glass, porcelain was made as either unipart or multi-part. Unipart insulators are made in one piece, if you will, and include a wire groove on the sides for the simple pony types, or on the top for larger ones. The larger insulators, as shown in this image here, might also include a skirt and an inner threaded petticoat. Manufacturer marks may be present, but not always. And like glass insulators, porcelain insulators exhibit a wide variety of colors, a result of exterior glazes that provided further protection for high voltage lines. Unipart insulators are appropriately classified by collectors under the U system, which stands for unipart. Multi-part insulators, like their glass counterparts, are made in two components that are fit together with cement. These insulators are classified by collectors under the M system, which stands for multi-part. The ones shown here are two-part insulators. Some were made as three-part insulators and designed for very high voltage lines. The glass and the porcelain insulators that I've shown you thus far are the common types we've all seen on utility lines and transmission lines. But with the proliferation of low voltage electrical lines, especially in urban areas, we'll often see companion insulators on poles that offer additional protection for connecting lines, as well as dead-end poles and guy wires that terminate into the ground. These insulators, known as spools and guys, are often seen on utility lines alongside our traditional styles. When high voltage towers were constructed in the early 20th century, engineers needed a much more efficient insulator to ensure minimal loss of electricity along the overall line. Suspension insulators were developed, made from glass or porcelain. These insulator types are essentially interconnected insulators that together provide the requisite protection. Most suspension insulators that I have documented as artifacts are porcelain, although, as I've mentioned just a few minutes before, glass was also used and is still used today. Be sure to look for maker marks and patent information on these insulators, as they may help to determine when they were made. These marks aren't just on the porcelain portions of the insulators themselves, but also on the interconnecting components like the pins and the caps. With the availability of electricity in the 20th century, existing buildings and businesses were upgraded to take advantage of this new technology. On these types of buildings and houses and other structures, whether we're looking at mines or large industrial facilities, urban settings, or rural farms, we're likely to find whole or fragmented electrical porcelain insulators, as displayed on this slide. Cleats, knobs, and tubes. Cleats were essentially used to anchor wire to a wall, a ceiling, or on appliances like hanging lights. Knobs and tubes were used in buildings to ensure safe and reliable installation of wire in walls, ceilings, and on the exterior eaves of the buildings. Tubes were designed specifically to be installed inside the joists, thereby affording a level of protection between the wire itself and the wood of the joists. Knobs and split knobs were also used in rural settings, on electrical fences, and on trees, which could conveniently be used in place of utility poles. Though small in size compared to their counterparts, cleats, knobs, and tubes often contain maker mark information that can be useful for at least indicating when a home, a business, or any facility was equipped for electrical use. HAAC has provided a Word document on the APF website for all of you to download. This document includes useful resources and websites for identifying historical artifacts, including glass and porcelain insulators. We encourage you to keep this document at hand when you encounter historical artifacts. When I document insulators in the field, I look especially for color and shape. If I can record the shape, I can look up the appropriate CD style, U style, or M style online on the various websites, and possibly get background information that includes the style's range of manufactured, that is the temporal range of manufacture, as well as what type of utility or line that the insulator might have been produced for. It goes without saying that maker marks and style numbers are very useful temporal markers, as are other attributes like the presence or absence of threads, as well as drip points and specialized markers like made in USA. Quite often we'll find insulators on the ground and in close vicinity to the utility or telephone lines from whence they originated. If the insulators are old, then it would behoove you to investigate said utility line to ascertain whether it's worth recording as a historical resource. This is especially relevant for those lines that occur within your project area. It's not surprising to find insulators and their utility lines on mining sites, logging sites, transportation sites, and extensive farms and ranches. In urban settings, we'll find insulators in and around parcels that were once occupied by commercial or residential properties. If insulators are found in secondary deposits like trash scatters, waste pile sites, or open dumps, they'll have limited value since these artifacts originated from elsewhere and were deposited essentially in the middle of nowhere as a matter of convenience and practice. Understanding the historic context of the project area and the immediate area is very important for understanding the why, the when, the what, and the how of insulators and other artifact types in any artifact assemblage. Mind you, like many historical artifacts, finding a general range of production for insulators doesn't mean this is when the insulator was discarded to become part of the archaeological record. Insulators were made to last. I'm sure we all live in proximity to old railroads and highways. Here in the Valley, if you were to drive along US 80 through Buckeye and Gila Bend, or perhaps along the original Southern Pacific Main Line to Yuma, you'll see their parallel telephone and low power utility lines that still exhibit a wide variety of multicolored glass and porcelain insulators, many of which were installed decades ago and are still in use. Before I start a discussion on ammunition, I must acknowledge that some or many of you attending this webinar this evening have far more experience and knowledge about guns and firearms than I do. So please comment or criticize as I go through this short presentation. I think I should also note once again that this webinar series focuses on artifacts of the late historic period from 1865 to 1972. 1972, of course, representing the 50-year threshold for historical resources. We'll all be hearing in the next few months news about the discovery of one or more Spanish-era sites in southern Arizona, some possibly dating to Coronado's expedition in 1542. Artifacts found on these very early historical period sites would possibly include lead shot, which was used through the Spanish and Mexican periods. By the 1830s and 40s, early conical bullets, like the mini ball, had been developed and popularized in Europe and America, just in time for the American Civil War. Breech loading guns, though produced in America prior to the Civil War, didn't effectively replace muzzle loaders until after the Great Conflict. It was in this post-Civil War era that Arizona's population grew along its major rivers and in the mineral-rich mountains of the territory. By this time, metallic bullets for breech-loading guns were manufactured in ever-increasing quantities, not to mention shapes and sizes, whether we're talking about pinfire, centerfire, or rimfire types. Then, of course, there was the proliferation of shotguns after about 1880. It's no surprise then that most of the ammunition-related artifacts that we document on historical sites date from the post-war period of the late 19th century and well into the modern era. Technically, there are also slug shots, or shot slugs, I should say, shot slugs. But I don't think we need to go that far with this current discussion. We don't often find firearms or guns on archaeological sites, except perhaps during excavation. Like tools, and perhaps more so, firearms were highly valued by their owners. What we do see on archaeological sites and scattered across the desert and along transportation corridors are discarded or spent cartridges and shot shells. In fact, it is not uncommon to find discarded ammunition on sites that have no association whatsoever with the site's occupation, use, or abandonment. This is essentially because hunters and recreationists through the late historic period and even in the modern era have consciously and unconsciously left their mark on the desert and rural landscape. Of course, there are sites that do have associated assemblage of spent ammunition. This is only one of the challenges that we as archaeologists must deal with when documenting sites. It is worthwhile, therefore, that we familiarize ourselves with ammunition and their use through the late historical period, if for nothing else than to assess the potential disturbance of a given site over time. Cartridges are made for handguns and rifles. Historically, the bullet was made from lead or a similar alloy, with the casings made from brass or copper. Shown here is the general anatomy of the cartridge, including the body, the neck, shoulder, and rim. Following the Civil War, there were generally three kinds of cartridges: pinfire, rimfire, and centerfire. Pinfire cartridges were among the first of the breech-loading ammunition to be made with a metal casing and saw widespread use in the Civil War. I must confess I can't recall ever finding a pinfire cartridge on any sites here in Arizona, although it's possible they could be found on early sites in southern Arizona predating the Civil War era. Pinfire bullets became obsolete for popular use before the 20th century and appear to have been limited or have seen limited use since this time on specialized guns and miniature guns. They are apparently still made today, though, for vintage replicas or very small caliber weapons. We're more likely to find rimfires and centerfires when recording late historical period sites. The primary difference between these two cartridges is in the location of the primer or the pin mark that is ignited to send the bullet flying. Centerfire primers are located centrally in the casing, as shown in the image here, while the base of the rimfire serves as the primer. As you can see here, rimfires are also much smaller, though there are exceptions to that rule as well. Cartridges, especially centerfires, come in all shapes and sizes, which are defined by their caliber. So what is caliber anyway? Technically, the caliber of a cartridge is dependent on the diameter of the firearm's barrel or bore. As shown on this slide, rifles and handguns have slotted barrels to stabilize the projectile as they leave the barrel. Shotguns, on the other hand, are smooth. But since we find only cartridges in the field rather than the firearm itself, can we still determine its caliber? The answer is yes, and we can do so in both metric and standard measurement. In terms of measurement, 1 caliber is equal to 1 inch or 25.4 millimeters. Essentially, the smaller the caliber, the smaller the bullet. While not an exact science, should it be necessary, we can actually calculate the caliber of a cartridge. The key is in measuring the interior diameter of the cartridge neck, where the bullet would be inserted. Mind you, it's important to first determine whether the cartridge in question is a center fire or rim fire type. For center fire cartridges, the inner diameter will be slightly smaller than the bullet itself, since tension between the bullet and the cartridge neck are a requisite for safe and accurate firing of the projectile. Enthusiasts prefer tensions of either 0.01, I should say 0.001, 0.002, or 0.003 inches for center fire bullets, corresponding to the difference in diameter between the cartridge neck and the bullet. For rimfire cartridges, the heel of the bullet itself is slightly tapered so that it fits tightly into the cartridge. The caliber isn't everything, considering that in many cases, the diameters of different cartridge types are quite similar. For instance, the popular 9mm is similar in terms of diameter to the .357 Magnum and the .38s. Likewise, the .308 Winchester is essentially the same as the .30-06 Springfield. The difference between all of these center fire styles is not in their diameter, but in their body lengths and their shapes, as well as the rim diameters. Does this mean we need to bring calipers with us on an archaeological survey when recording sites? Fortunately, no, since most cartridges are stamped on the rims with the manufacturer and the caliber. Shot shells differ from cartridges in that they are packed with shot. The primer, powder, and wad are in the rear to propel the shot from the barrel. Historically, the head was made of brass, although steel is also used today. The shot and other components were also historically packed in paper through much of the late historic period, but now they're largely packed in plastic. For the most part, gauges are determined not just by the diameter of the shotgun bore, but also as a unit of weight. For a 12-gauge shotgun, for instance, it would take 12 balls of the same diameter as the shotgun bore to equal 1 pound of lead. Now, this type of measurement harkens back many centuries when an individual had to buy lead in bulk and make their own shot. Generally, the smaller the gauge, the larger the bore or the barrel. Interestingly, as shown on the image to the right, the 410 shot shell is the only gauge that directly correlates to the actual bore diameter of the shotgun. As I noted previously, shot shells were once packaged in paper. By the early 1960s, however, plastic began to replace paper as the preference for packaging. This is one way to at least roughly determine the age of a shotgun head that you might find on an archaeological site. If you look closely in the interior of the shot head, you might notice either plastic remnants or paper. You'll at least know if the shotgun shell is pre-1960s or post-1960s. Of course, the surest way to get journal dates of manufacture for any cartridge or shot shell are from the head stamps. Rimfire head stamps are understandably limited due to size, but for center fires, one can ascertain the caliber and the manufacturer, likewise with shot shell head stamps. Over the years, I've compiled a database of sorts of various head stamps and their general range of manufacture. Some of the dates shown here are from personal correspondence from museum experts. Others are from collectors and well-known firearm experts. Just an FYI, there are enthusiasts who collect vintage ammunition boxes. I've downloaded some of these materials as well. As you can see, the boxes typically contain an image or a photo of the cartridge or the shell that included the maker mark. By comparing boxes from the same company over a period of years, one might be able to generate a temporal range of manufacture for specific head stamps, like the P that is shown on the box. I told you all earlier that quite often, ammunition identified on the site may not be related to the site itself, but reflect later activity by hunters and recreationists. However, there are some sites, notably battlefields, wherein the pattern of artifacts and ammunition on the landscape can provide important supplementary information for the site as it relates to the said battle or event. Here in Arizona, there were a handful of skirmishes during the American Civil War, and of course, numerous conflicts between the indigenous peoples and the American military and Euro-American settlers. One notable area of intensive military activity in the 20th century was in Western Arizona. In 1942, the Desert Training Center was established in California to train General Patton's 1st Armored Corps for the expected campaign in North Africa. Within a year, the area was expanded into Arizona and renamed the California-Arizona Maneuver Area, or CAMA. No longer just training for desert tank warfare, the DTC CAMA, as it was known, now hosted a variety of troops and units headed for war in Europe and the Pacific. This included infantry, tanks, heavy gunnery, and flight training. Roads were graded, camps were established, and troops transported to the area. One of the largest camps on the Arizona side was Camp Bouse, which at its peak housed more than 5,000 troops for a period of about 8 months. In the 2-year period of activity at the DTC CAMA, troops constructed guns and rifle ranges, heavy gunnery ranges, ranges for combat training, and temporary training camps for overnight operations. Several airports were located in California, but in Arizona, the airplane activity appears to have been limited to low altitude gunnery ranges and high altitude bombing ranges, as shown by the arrows at the bottom of the screen here. By 1945, the entire DTC CAMA area was deserted, and many of these areas transformed to archaeological sites over several decades. Statistical research has completed in just the last decade multiple surveys and context studies related to this important period of Arizona's history. Indeed, several other companies, including ACS, have completed surveys in just the last several years as solar companies take advantage of the bare desert for construction of solar farms. The yellow box that you can see at the bottom of the slide here was one of the survey areas that ACS conducted on the DTC CAMA. You'll notice that it was located just north of a once active low altitude gunnery range. Initially, we didn't have this map to help us in our preparation of the survey. During the survey, we recorded a sizable number of isolated 50 caliber rounds, spent cartridges, unspent bullets, which these 50 caliber rounds were used in Browning machine guns. We were puzzled by their distribution and the infrequently occurrences across hundreds of acres. There were no tank tracks that we found, no camps, and no concentrations of these cartridges to indicate there was ground combat activity. I finally found the map shown in the book. I finally found this map that's shown on the slide in the book titled Where Heroes Trained, which was written by World War II veterans who had trained at Camp Bouse. With this map and with the results of the survey, we were able to confidently conclude that the pattern of isolated cartridges reflected aircraft activity related to strafing in the low altitude gunnery range just to the south of us. Indeed, one of the most common artifacts on the DTC CAMA are cartridges of various caliber, as well as clips, belt links, and even grenade components. Their identification on survey might indicate the activity that occurred in the immediate area, whether they're shooting ranges, combat training, aircraft or tank battle simulations, and other targeting areas. Through the course of World War II, several federal installations were operating across the country, producing the millions of rounds that were used in Europe and the Pacific. The top head stamp shown here in this slide was made by Frankfurt Arsenal in 1947. Now, as all of us should know, World War II had ended by 1945. So the presence of this 1947 cartridge was likely as a result of use of the DTC CAMA in the 1950s at the peak of the Cold War, when other training activities were taking place in this area. Just as an aside, there are some important points to keep in mind when visiting areas formerly part of the CAMA DTC, not to mention other military training areas, either here in Arizona or in various parts of the country. Point number one, be careful of unexploded ordnance that may be visible on the ground surface. It may have been partially or entirely buried by sediments and soil over the last 80 years. Archaeologists who work on these lands, they have to go through specific training protocols and be able to recognize these potentially dangerous munitions. We can't and don't record these types of artifacts when we're pretty confident they're live unexploded ordnance. What we do is we call a specific number and the experts come out to retrieve these. This next point is not just for these former military training areas, but for all public lands, whether federal, tribal, state, county, or local. Please visit and treat archaeological sites with respect. In terms of artifacts, it's imperative that we do not collect artifacts from an archaeological site unless permitted to do so by the landowning or managing agencies. There are multiple laws in place that prohibit this activity, considering that doing so impacts the integrity of the site. These laws include or are written not just for prehistoric artifacts, but also historical artifacts. While we may be tempted to assume that metal cans, broken bottles, and scattered ammunition are not terribly important, they may indeed contribute important information as to how the site developed over time. More importantly, and for your safety, landowning agencies make no distinction between these artifact types. Collecting any artifacts from public lands may result in both fines and incarceration. Many of you that are watching this session and attending these webinar series over the next few months are site stewards and are working with the Arizona SHPO and the land managing agencies to protect important sites from vandalism. If you have any questions about historical artifacts on any given site and whether they belong on these sites, we urge you to first contact your supervisors about how these artifacts will be treated. This concludes our presentation this evening on insulators and ammunition. I want to thank you all once again for attending. We are delighted to have you. I'm happy to address any questions with what time is remaining, but you're welcome to also send me emails with any kinds of questions, concerns, critiques, and anything else that crosses your mind. I know that some have requested copies of the table with cartridge manufacturers and their respective date ranges. I promise to get this table updated very soon and prepared for distribution on the Arizona Preservation Foundation website. I'll also have SHPO upload some additional information that might be useful for all of us, including the site etiquette guide. Please join us again next month on March 24th as we discuss tools, hardware, tech, and personal items. Thank you all once again. Have a great evening and stay safe.